Thank you. I'm going to make a little bit of a transition where we've talked about a lot of sort of, not the end goal, but typically working with adults. And before I start, what I'd like you to do is, there should be a small little bag near you somewhere. If you can open that and just start tinkering with some of the pieces inside. I will come back to this in the middle of my presentation, but the hope is that you can build some small objects. I didn't give you many pieces, but if you can start with that, that would be great. So I'm Adam Maltese. I am out in Indiana in the middle of the US. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the work we've done in making an education. So to start a little bit with who I am, I was able to dig up a picture of my daughter at Korean night at our university from a number of years ago. And it's important to know that, like TJ, my thinking has changed since I've had kids. And I am an educational researcher. I used to teach science. Now I work to prepare future science teachers. I also run a makerspace at our School of Education. We do a lot of research on making. And the last part is that I still get my hands dirty even though I don't really know what I'm doing most of the time. And one of the interesting offshoots of this is that my children who see me making and see me trying to teach others how to make, they have this belief now that I can make anything. And I think that that's one of the most powerful beliefs that they can have. The reality is I can't, but it's great that they are going through life thinking about the possibility where anything can be made. So this is just a little image of our makerspace that we have at the School of Education, where we've got many of the tools that have been shown already, but we're trying to get teachers to adopt some of these technologies and think about how they can use those in their classrooms. So I'm going to talk about some of the projects that we've had, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. We started some of this work with a project called Making STEM Pathways. This was funded by Google, and what this was looking at is how people get interested in STEM. That's sort of where my work has been for the last 10 years. And what we were looking at specifically in this work is how engineers, how computer scientists, and how other STEM professionals originally got interested in the subject as young children, and how that interest continued. And one of the things that we were looking at there was trying to focus in on the role that making and tinkering played in that. And one of the things we learned from that is that many of those STEM professionals talked about the role of failure, and that they never got a chance to fail when they were younger children. They only ever got that chance to fail when they were professionals or maybe in graduate school. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how that could, you know, if we can change that in education, that could be really meaningful. And so we've had a project going for the last few years that's funded by the National Science Foundation, where we're looking at what happens when kids fail while they're making. And we look at how the educators respond, or actually are the cause of some of these failures, and thinking about how we can try to increase the resilience and persistence in some of these students. From that project, we went into another project funded by Google that is focusing on the outcomes of participating in making. There are a number of outcomes. In this project, what we're trying to do is to think about some of these attitudinal outcomes or affective outcomes. And we're looking at things like the development of agency or independence, participation in STEM practices, my area, which is the development of STEM interest, the development of creativity and creative skills, and then the development of creative thinking, and then tying back to our previous project, also issues and ideas around failure. And so we're developing tools so that educators can use those tools to measure what's happening, and they can then change their programming based on the results. What you have in front of you is part from one of the projects called Make Engineering, and this is funded by another government organization in the US. And the idea with this is that the notion of making has a lot of promise. But that promise hasn't been realized, particularly in the US, where we say everybody can make, but the reality is it's mostly white, upper middle class people who are doing the making. And so it really hasn't engaged all of the students. So what we were trying to do in this project was create some materials that could go into low-income schools, into the libraries, so that students from those schools could take the materials home and build with their families. And so the kits that you have in front of you, the little pieces, are from that. And so what I'd like to quickly ask you to do is, if you've built a little object, if you can turn to the person next to you and try to connect your object with their object, that would be great. And I did, thankfully, somebody chuckled a little bit. Part of this that's important is that making leads to joy, and we don't need to take joy out of education. And so making often can engage students by making education more joyful and different than it currently is. From that project, we had the idea to work with families and children so that they could learn more about STEM and potential opportunities in engineering, and use making to help solve problems in their home, in their community, and in their schools. So this project is just starting, but the whole idea is that we'll spend the next 3 years working with families, typically very poor families with quite low incomes. But the idea is to empower them to realize that they do have the skills and they can get the knowledge to be able to change their own futures. And then the final one is a project that's also funded by Google and a group called MakerEd. And this is a way, what we're investigating in this area is how we can get more people across our state, so our state of Indiana, how we can get more educators to engage in these types of practices of making, and how we can support them so that they don't feel like they're alone. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is what I'll call for this conventional educational dogma. And the idea that we often believe, and this is a we meaning globally, is that, and this is a story that we often sort of tell or pass on to our children, is that students go to school, and then they go from school to higher education, and then higher education into technical jobs or a variety of jobs, and that in doing that, they earn money, and that money also leads to happiness. And I don't fully disagree with this, but I've been thinking about how this type of model is similar or different from a model that many of our countries believe in, which is that the state of the economy and the future economic success of a country is tied to innovation. And again, I don't disagree with that. But then they make the jump that innovation is often based on STEM and people in STEM, and that's not the only thing, but that's a key thing that they talk about. And they will typically then make the next step, which is that in order to improve STEM, we need to make our education around that topic more rigorous. And the way we typically get there is through direct didactic learning, where we teach a lot of theory to the students so that they understand all of the history of science that has come before them. And of course, as you can imagine, as we continue to go as a society, right, that becomes harder and harder to do. And so I'm going to sort of challenge this a little bit here. And so it raises for me the question of, do we need to actually change this? We talked, the previous speakers talked about sort of essentially, what the future looks like. The future is actually right now. But oftentimes we hear, my son is a kindergartner, he's 6 years old, and right now I'm often hearing statements like, when today's 6-year-olds are entering the workforce, something like 40 or 50% of the jobs that they will have not even been invented yet. They haven't been created yet. So if we educate in the traditional way, it seems like we're setting them up for failure, where we need to create educational systems that lead to more flexible thinking and more innovative thinking. And for users of maker cities, and also those who can create and push the boundaries of those, we need to sort of develop this in our students. And so what I want to do here is challenge this notion that school can lead to innovation. And I would say that currently, schooling cannot really lead to innovation. It often leads to good test performance, but it does not necessarily lead to innovative thinking. And I think making is one of the ways we can get there. So there's a couple different ways that have been shown to actually help develop skills and the propensity toward developing innovative thinking in students. One is inquiry instruction. Another one is engaging them in authentic practices, and again, some of those have been discussed already. It may be surprising to you, but actually engaging people across the age spectrum, not only children, but even adults in play, has been shown to lead to creative thinking. And then what I'm going to talk about is making. Now, I wish I could stand up here and say to you that, if you send me an email, I can send you a list of hundreds of papers that document the efficacy of these approaches. I can't, and that's part of where social sciences and education research is challenging. But what is there looks very promising. And so we're going to move forward on that notion. So we talk about making as if it's a new thing. We've been making for 2.6 million years. It's only now that we've sort of come back to this and we've got this infusion of newer technologies and cheaper technologies that we can use. But this really is a return to things that we've been doing. So, we've got some objects from sort of the original makers, let's say, that actually allowed us to get to where we are today. And then there's other traditional materials that have really never gone away, but we'll call that making 2.0. And then a lot of what we're up here talking about now, and some of the stuff that you all are probably here to talk about and think about, and that gets exciting, are things like 3D printing and laser cutting, and working with microcontrollers and sensors and those sorts of things. And that seems to be more of the cutting edge that a lot of people want to talk about. But I think it's important to not discount all of the traditional making that is out there still. And it doesn't necessarily need to be high tech. So it's also important to think about where making happens. Oftentimes, maker spaces look something like this. You can see everyone's face there is smiling. But this might be what a makerspace looks like with younger children who are actively engaged in thinking about and doing and making things, manifestations of the thoughts in their head. We can make it a slightly mobile makerspace like this, which is a cart that can move around with materials on it. Or this is coming from the Bay Area. This is called the Try It truck. And this goes around to schools, taking the equipment around and allowing students to engage. And it's interesting that one of the favorite activities when this Makermobile shows up at a school is kids hammering nails into wood. They so rarely get the chance to just use a hammer and nails or a screwdriver that is one of the things that they seem to love the most. And so they just have blocks of wood and nails, and they allow them to do that just to give them the experience, because that seems to be missing. But one of the things that I would be remiss to say, if I didn't say it now, is that it's not about the space. We often want to make it about building a space and the materials in that space. But a makerspace by itself doesn't do anything. So it's really about thinking about how we can educate people to work within that space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've done with trying to train teachers around this. And one of the things that has become true in all of this work, for me and for many of the people that I work with, is this notion that making, it's not what to teach, so it's not a whole lot of new content. And it's not where to teach, so it's not just about the maker space, but it's a way to teach. So it's sort of a revision of a teaching approach rather than a whole new class that would need to be offered. And I think that that makes it more approachable and less scary. So around this idea, we realized that a lot of people were interested in this and wanting training. So we developed a company to help to consult with schools and educators and offer training. And last summer, we had our first batch in what we called a boot camp, and we had 70 educators from around the country. And as we were developing the content for this course, I was doing a little bit of looking through the data from where these teachers came from. And when it really hit me of the power that we could have in helping these teachers is when we found that those teachers themselves taught over 40,000 students. Then it really hit me that, wow, we can really have an impact with this. And so we had an amazing group of teachers who came and dedicated probably 11 hours a day to thinking about making over a span of 5 days. And they went from not knowing much at all, some of them, to being able to program, being able to 3D print, being able to laser cut, and it was really an amazing experience. And so some of this comes from my discussions with them and from other work that we've done. And I thought it was important to put out the notions of what we think are the benefits of making with youth. So I think one of the things that would be a change for education, and just as a note, I put QR codes on most of these slides if you ever get a chance to look at them. This is a great project from my friend Jeff in Chicago. And what this is this is a flag, the Chicago flag for the city, but each one of the blocks was created by a different student. And the idea is that that block was an individual block that they created themselves, but collectively, it adds up to make this beautiful flag. And this was covered in a lot of, this got a lot of press, but it's just a brilliant idea for how we can do this where each student can be an individual and represent themselves as an individual, but we can also work towards sort of a collective goal. Making also allows for exploration. And so as we allow children and kids and even adults to do making, I can promise you that they are going to break more things than they did before we allowed them to do that. But they will actually, if you give them this chance, they will create more things too. And usually they were never given that chance before, and that's an important thing. And it's important, as much as we want to protect our children from failure, this is one of the things that we found in this project around failure is this nervousness about failure is actually seems to be an adult issue. The children aren't really afraid of failure. It's the adults who say that the children must be afraid of failure because we are afraid of failure. And so if we help them understand that failure is part of the design process and that things actually often benefit if we evaluate the failure and why it happened, then I think we can help them think about that as a learning process, part of the learning process. So one of the other cool things is that there's this look that individuals get when they see something that they had in their mind come out in front of them, whether it was 3D printed or they sewed it or whatever, and the look on these faces really represents that. There's this look, and it, as an educator, it is addictive. That as soon as you see this in your students or individuals you're working with, you want to see it over and over again because it really is this show of joy and the proudness of I put in investment, I tried, and look at what I was able to produce. So I'm not going to be able to go through all of these, but I just put up a couple examples here of some amazing projects that you should look into and amazing things that are happening out there when we allow making to occur. One of them is the Girls' Garage in the Bay Area, where there are young girls learning to weld and building things and being empowered in that way. The Enable project is a project that puts up 3D designs for prosthetic limbs, and people will create those prosthetics, and then they can mail them to children who need those. And what's great about that is the videos for how to put them together are actually done by kids. So it's sort of a great thing. Change Hub is a project, it's actually for adults, but it's for prisoners in Kenya. And it is allowing prisoners to get involved in making, and they are building a better future for themselves and also creating a business around that. And then the final one is the social justice quilt, which is allowing students and quilters to express themselves and express the injustices around them and that they're involved in their daily lives through this art of quilting. So this is a story. The hand in the upper left is a hand that I built with my children and put together. This girl on the right is using a hand that a faculty member for our university had created for her in a similar way. And then just yesterday, as we were visiting a fab lab here in Seoul, that hand in the lower left is the hand that they built. And so you can see that there's a lot of similarities there, but the whole idea is that we can actually use these tools to create and make the world better for individuals who otherwise might have struggles in getting this to be an improvement for them. So this was a very powerful quote. We had our students, the teachers that we were working with this summer, we built a small portable shower, and we put a camera in the shower for them to sit in and sort of tell us how they were feeling and how they were experiencing the training that we gave them. And one of our students went in there and said this, which is, I envision a student from somebody's maker classroom developing something to help people with diseases like me. I can see these kids taking their skills from a maker class to develop a cure for cancer, developing ways to stop world hunger. The possibilities are endless, very endless. That's why we make. And that seemed to really capture this notion of what is possible in making. And this woman works with very underserved students, but she's already pushing to have this happen a lot in her classroom. So as we sort of come to the end here for me, I want to be clear about where it seems that making sort of beats out regular education or traditional education. It allows for individualization. It allows for our youth across the age spectrum to really engage in authentic practice. And what I mean there is they actually are thinking about and solving real problems rather than problems that we give them that are fake. It allows them to explore, and again, take risks, but to explore the world around them and to troubleshoot when things don't work. And that's an important thing. I imagine that you all troubleshoot frequently in your life when things aren't working. And so we should train that skill. It also has the great benefits of leading to feelings of enjoyment, empowerment, independence, and then the building of skills. And those are all the things that we need our youth to have as they move forward and become adults. So some of the things that we've learned, that teachers and educators, so not just teachers in schools, but educators in museums and in after school, they need training and support. And this is particularly when it comes to making. So this is a new thing for a lot of people, but they need training and support. Some will embrace this, but many of them will resist because they see this as just one more thing that they have to try to achieve in their classrooms when they've got all these other needs. But you have to trust me in that when they see this with their students, most of them change and become full believers in this and try to convince their colleagues of how important it is. Some children will resist, but most will embrace it because it's much different than their regular education. And the children that resist are actually usually the students who are the best at school because they've learned that system and they've learned how to do well in that system, but they will often resist because this actually makes them think. And so that's important to keep in mind. And success is a good problem. What happens here is when you have students programming at a very young age or making at a very young age, as they move through the system, they demand from their teachers that the teachers push them and advance their skills. So we've seen a couple school districts around the country where the teachers have had to really continue to update their knowledge to stay in front of the children. Many parents will resist because this does not look like the education that we had. But you need to convince them that the education that they had maybe was not the best, and that we actually are working to really advance things and prepare their children for a better future. Assessments must follow. So national assessments, local assessments, this is the thing that people are actively working on, but it's a challenge, and so it's important to keep that in mind. We often focus on high tech, but we also need to think about low tech, building with cardboard, building with basic blocks like Legos and other things, and paper. That's very important. And it's really about focusing on the approach and not on the materials. So one key thing is that it's important to think about making the connection to cultural traditions. So on a visit to a local museum the other day, I was able to take some pictures. These are chisels, right, that most people would know as chisels, but they're from a few hundred years ago. This mold, this book, this mask, right, this loom, those are all things that are part of Korean culture. And I'll go back for a minute. They're all things that are part of the Korean culture. We should tap into those, and that will get all generations agreeing that this is an important thing and we can continue those traditions. And so I think one of the important things, these are 2 different days with the view from my hotel room of Seoul. And one of them is sort of murky and cloudy, and one of them is beautiful and clear. And I think it's important for us to try to think about using maker cities, using education, to think about which of these we want to be the future for our children. And I think that that's an important thing to think about, and I will leave you with that. Thank you.